Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here with Jillian Melcher and Joe Sternberg on Potomac Watch. I don't want to give listeners the impression that there's any joy here on this podcast, certainly not from me, about this malaise in Europe and these problems. I think this is a difficulty for the United States, too. We need a vibrant Europe. We need a vital continent with a democratic heritage that shares our fundamental values as we take on a world of change and authoritarians. So it's really distressing to me when you learn that the European economy now is about 2/3, Jillian, the size of the United States economy. It used to be roughly parity not too long ago. I was recently in California talking to a lot of people who are focusing on AI, artificial intelligence. And when you ask them, what role is Europe going to play in artificial intelligence, competing with the innovation in the U.S. and China? And they basically say, there is no role. They're completely out of it. They've got nothing. I mean, they maybe have a startup or two, but nothing major. And again, that's a sign of the lack of dynamism, and it bodes ill for the future. There are a little bit of, optimism. If you look at Greece, for example, got out of its debt trap with economic reform under Kyriakos Mitsotakis and his government. And that's what the major governments of Europe need to do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think they need to get serious on reform of the welfare state, serious on growth, and serious on defense. And unfortunately, you're seeing the opposite. I'm just looking at, for instance, France's plan on climate. And I think they've kind of accomplished the low-hanging fruit. And so you've got these really urgent policy documents talking about how, just to protect the world from the imminent threat of climate change. During the winter, you really can't turn your heat up. And in the summer, no higher AC than 78 degrees. And there's a bit of just like a surreal or magical thinking quality to this when you've actually got a very serious national security threat that is not being addressed. And I think that a lot of European leaders are asleep at the wheel. I think a lot of them are actually pretty cynical and engaging in opportunism by saying, you can have your welfare state. This is sustainable when it's not. Saying that you can tax the wealthy, you can tax corporations to pay for this. And unfortunately, it's one of those things that can't go on forever. And so it won't. And I think in France, at least, we're hitting that tipping point.
Joe, Jillian made a point earlier about the reaction in Europe to Donald Trump and coming back to Trump, too. I mean, if you talk to a European before the election, it was certainly fear and loathing. Oh, my God, he can't possibly win again. You Americans are nuts. But he has won, and now they confront his return. What's their general feeling in Europe's capitals about what they expect from Trump and how they're going to respond to him?
Well, in some ways, whether or not they realize this might be a slightly happier experience for them than Trump 1.0 was, because partly as a consequence of the Ukraine war that started in spring 2022, Europe has dramatically increased its defense expenditure. I mean, they're starting from too low a base, and they're very far behind building that industrial base, but they are trying now. And so they have managed to preemptively remove one of the big irritants in the first Trump administration, which was his frustration that Europe wasn't pulling enough of its own weight on defense. I mean, most of them are meeting NATO's 2% of GDP spending target now. Those that aren't seem to be headed in that direction. But against that, you have all of the concerns about the economy, and particularly tariffs, because the European economy is much more vulnerable now than it was in January of 2017. When he took the oath of office the first time. So I think that, the consequences of a tariff war, any kind of trade problems or frictions between the two sides is a real issue, because remember, this is the most important trading relationship for both sides, hands down. I mean, the amount of trade and also the amount of investment flowing between the U.S. and the European Union and the U.K. is much larger even than our relationship with China. And so I think that There's a lot of concern about the damage that the tariffs or other trade obstructions can do. But, the last note that I would add about this is that at the same time that you have politicians and political government leaders worried about Trump, I do think there's a certain amount of curiosity about him on the part of a lot of voters. And that reflects the fact that Americans have done the thing that a lot of European voters keep trying to do, which is to elect a sledgehammer who can try to break up this very ossified political and economic system. And you look at all of these European elections that we keep suffering through. I use that word advisedly.
Well, you have to write the editorials, so...
And as much as we suffer writing about it, the voters suffer having to vote in them because, they keep trying to elect these insurgent politicians, whether on the left or the right, to try to introduce an element of change and shake the system out of its torpor. And for a variety of reasons, that never quite happens. And Americans have, for better or worse, managed to do that. And I think there's a lot of curiosity about that over here.
The best way America can influence Europe, I think, is with success, economic and military and so on. When the American government and the American economy and people demonstrate that they are doing well, Europe looks over and says, maybe we ought to try that or do more of that, and has sometimes in the past shaken Europe out of its torpor. All right, Jillian, thank you. Joe, thank you. Thank you for your coverage of the European challenge, and thank you all for listening. We're here every day on Potomac Watch.